You're listening to The Performance-Driven Warehouse, turning complex operational data into measurable performance. The modern warehouse looks nothing like what it did 20, 10, or even 5 years ago. Thanks to the speed of the markets, tech advances, and changing business processes, the warehouse itself has evolved into a complex network of people, systems, and automation. Balancing all of this to keep on top of volatility, disruptions, and even new opportunities is kind of an art form. Successful warehouse management depends on how well you can see everything that's happening across your network. And that network is powered by data. But what good is all the data in the world if it's not under the right lens and connected in a strategic way so you can understand and act on it? In order to gain the visibility to manage cost, performance, and capacity in real time, you need to unify your data. That's what today's warehouse performance management is all about. Hello, I'm Dan Keto. Welcome to the Performance-Driven Warehouse, where industry experts and operators share how they've transformed data complexity into operational clarity. I'm your host, Dan Keto. I'm the co-founder and president of Easy Metrics. On this podcast, we will dive deep into how warehouse operations leaders turn complex data into operational intelligence and measurable performance gains. Today, we are joined by someone who has played a big role in shaping the industry's understanding of warehouse technology. Our guest, Dwight Klappich, is a Gartner Fellow and Research Vice President who has spent more than 40 years studying supply chain technologies and advising some of the largest global enterprises. As businesses continue to face increasing pressure to optimize labor and reduce costs, Dwight's insights into how data can justify or challenge automation investments are more crucial than ever. In today's conversation, we'll dive into the emerging field of warehouse performance management and how companies are using data to understand their operations. Dwight, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
So, Dwight, yeah. Thank you very much. So, Dwight, you and I go back a ways. We've worked together when you were at Gartner. Probably a year ago or so. You said, "Hey, you guys at Easy Metrics, you're not just labor management. You're something, way more than that." And you said, what you really are is warehouse performance management. And that's really evolving into a new category, we believe, in the warehousing operations. So why don't you give me your view on warehouse performance management? On a high level, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you're talking about that. I go back, it must have been about 8-10 years ago. I was presenting at the Warehouse Education, WERC, Research Council. And the title of my presentation at the time was Putting the M in WMS. My contention then and my contention today would be we shouldn't have been calling it a WMS for the last 40 years. We should have been calling it a warehouse execution system. What I meant that management is about empowering the supervisory workforce to not just get the job done, but to really focus on how do we do it better, faster, quicker, cheaper, all of that. And to be frank, there wasn't a lot of that in a WMS. I mean, WMS systems are primarily task execution systems. Receive a box, put a box away. I store it for a while. So every once in a while, I might go there and count it. I pick and pack and ship it. I mean, that's what I did. And so there wasn't a lot of that management capabilities. Decision support, you look at systems today. I was in the WMS space in the 1980s. And basically we just have better tools to do the same thing we were doing in the 1980s, reams of reports. Now maybe they're online and I can move columns around and do some things, but it's basically given some information to a warehouse manager, typically ex post facto, it's after the fact. So this is how you did yesterday. Are there some places that maybe I need to go shore some things up? So there wasn't a lot there. And then we weren't translating some of that information into things that really would help, a company do better. Now, I think labor management had some of that as I could look at my workforce and figure out, okay, I'm underperforming and maybe I'm having some challenges or my wasted time is higher than I want. That was one decent thing for a lot of people. The problem was that, people got too fixated on, the most complicated uses, engineered labor standards. So typically labor management was only used in really big, complex warehouses. But I thought the thing I saw in Easy Metrics back then was your ability to monetize some of that. to tell somebody, hey, this is what it's costing you, is really valuable information to that leadership, to really, understand. And I think, the one thing I think Easy Metrics talks about a lot that I saw was, okay, if I have one warehouse with 500 people, yeah, I can justify those tools, but a lot of companies don't, but they might have 10 warehouses with 500 people. And that ability now to look across my network and do some of that so that, the head of North American warehouse operations can really start to look at the performance, quote unquote, of my 10 warehouses. And geez, the one I thought would be the most expensive is actually cheaper than the one that I thought would be the cheapest. What's going on? Give me the tools that I can then drill down. And then it's not always, a week late or a month late or a quarter behind. It's getting that data, maybe not in real time, but in near real time, so that I can stay on those things and make the decisions, in time to actually fix it, as opposed to after the fact that it's already done. It's nice to know that I shot 100, playing golf yesterday, but okay, what's that telling me, right? Next time maybe I'll go out. Will I do better? Maybe by the sixth hole, if it had told me something, there are things I could have done to fix that. So,
Yeah, you actually bring up a really good point, because I've always found it interesting that WMSs are fantastic as a tool to track inventory state at all times and basically line things up to be done. But I agree with you. There hasn't been a lot of analytics incorporated into the WMS. And I think possibly it's because, like with labor management, there's a pretty complex abstraction layer to get to all the granular performance engineering and cost analytics that we do. And we've seen that the WMS providers are more focused on the technology side, not the business case side. And so when you look at labor management, there's a strong business case component in optimizing the engineering, optimizing cost structures, and so forth. And perhaps that's maybe the missing element that the WMS, vendors who build these, great software, but they don't have that contextual understanding from an operator's perspective that would then liberate that information into these things that really help you understand where all those cost and performance opportunities are in your business. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying there.
yeah, and I mean, to be frank, I mean, just to add to that is I don't blame the vendors necessarily, but one of the other problems we had for years was labor management. Even if someone was going to do it, it tended to be a follow-on project. And one of the problems with WMS is we'd see a lot of, implementation fatigue. So they just spent, 2 years, 3 years sometimes putting up all their warehouses. Now they have to come back and they just lost the momentum. And, then there's a lot of change management, getting, even if you have the tools, I often say, you can give me a circular saw and I can cut a board fast. That's not going to make me a skilled carpenter. That's just going to let me cut a board really fast. And I think those are some of the things that we needed to focus on to get that supervisory workforce. And we're seeing some, good progress over the last couple of years, because I think, to be frank, I mean, so many companies have tapped out everything they can do in their WMS. They've squeezed that sponge as hard as they can. And, world's more complicated. Labor's a challenge for a lot of companies. They need to really start thinking about some of this. So I think we're starting to see a lot more, acceptance that, hey, these is something we need to do. So,
Yeah, we're jumping ahead here, but I'll just put a pin in this component. We see AI as the liberator for change management in labor management. Because to your point, you've got change management just getting people to use the WMS properly, but then when you get into the labor management side, you have the change management, which is, I am a supervisor. I notice that there's some performance areas of improvement. I need to then coach my employees, do the proper things to make them more productive on that process. That sort of thing actually a bit more of a lift often than just learning how to use the software properly. And so we see AI as being able to really assist people in this process. But we'll get back to that. I want to kind of circle back onto the
I would
warehouse
agree with you on that
performance management. So, when we look at, going beyond labor management, we look at warehouse performance now. Management really is the next evolution of warehouse performance management. So, we're seeing facilities, standing up robotics, automation systems. They're getting telematics on their forklifts. So you're getting all these other data sources that are coming online that add to the story of the WMS and the labor management system. So one of the things I thought was really, fun talking to you about at the Gartner conference a couple months ago, you talked about the evolution of data in the warehouse and how in the 70s, we're in this crazy environment of fragmented stuff and it consolidating went back. So I'd love you to repeat that story, because that really is this ebb and flow evolution that we're going through, and it's kind of got us to this point where we are today, where we're again in this hyper complex fragmented environment.
Yeah, I mean, what we often say is, companies are not for lack of data. What they lack is information. And there's been some challenges that we've seen in a lot of those companies. Is one, the data they need can be in multiple different systems. I might have some information in my time and attendance system. I have something in my WMS. Maybe I have some telematics or a fleet management on my lift trucks, and I've got information in multiple places. And then that's great if I have one of each of those, but it was not uncommon for us to talk to clients that had multiple different WMSs. I think the worst I ever saw was one that had 27 different commercial WMSs, a big 3PL. And so, one of their frustrations is there is nearly impossible for them to get to a single pane of glass so that their leadership could see what was going on. Because, well, this, warehouse is running this WMS, and this one's running this WMS, and this one's running, something else. But then the other challenge there was getting that data pulled together. Because, I often said it would have been like, one system was in English, another one was in Spanish, and another one was in Klingon. And somehow I have to be able to figure out how to pull the data out of those systems, then, kind of concatenate that intelligently, because how do I get that data to line up? I mean, would it be nice to know, hey, they clocked in at 7, but they didn't log on to their WMS until 7:30, and they clocked out, well, now we got to combine those things because it clocked in one system, but they logged on to another system. So it proved very difficult for clients to start to pull some of that together. You ended up with just some basic challenges in, you talk about the whole master data management. We've been talking about that for years. And is master data management a system or is it a discipline? If you talk to our data guys at Gartner in the past, they would have said it's first a discipline. Then the technology can help that. But if you just buy the technology without the discipline, you're not going to get that. And so something as simple as, what's the description of the product? Is it 32-ounce liquid Tide, or is it liquid Tide 32 ounces? Is it Tide liquid 32 ounces? I mean, all the same products. And now when I say, well, I've got multiple ERPs, multiple WMSs, basically what we've seen is people got stuck at best doing stuff at the facility level. And even then, if I want to cross 5 facilities, because they're all in different places, different times, different technologies, they would all be at, different levels on how well they did something. One of the most sophisticated sites might actually be doing some pretty cool stuff. Other sites, years behind. And that would be just in the United States. You start trying to do that on a global basis, and you just see that it's, I would say there's been more failures at this than successes, because, trying to bring that all together into one place and normalize the information so that you can start to do this is proved a lot more difficult than companies thought.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you a use case that really highlights what you just said. So one of our customers up in Canada has 11 facilities just in one city, and they had a different data taxonomy for each of their facilities. And so this is the same WMS, but you work with your general managers, your ops managers there, and set it up at that site, and they have the names that they want to call things because that's just what they're used to. And no one ever thought of the greater picture when they're doing that. They're like, I'm trying to just optimize this for my site. So to your point, that there's a discipline there, and at the time people were doing that, it made common sense what they were doing, because data wasn't being liberated into a network view, wasn't being elevated into the value that we're have discovered over the last decade how valuable data is. In fact, there, as everyone's heard, data is the new gold, and so now everyone's scrambling to figure out, how do I get to that data? How do I extract the value out of it? And this goes back to this mantra that we've been beating the drum on now for the last several years: is you've got to start with the unified data model.
Yeah.
Because if you don't take a thoughtful approach and construct this data model, you're going to have a very difficult time getting to that value, and then also being able to leverage these newer technologies that are coming down the pipeline. So the cool thing that we see, though, is companies now are, taking advantage of data warehouses. So you've got your Snowflakes and your Databricks and your BigQueries and so forth. So you get all these new data warehouse technologies that are coming on board. So they're now able to at least liberate the data and consolidate it. But there's still a very big lift to go through to come up with that common taxonomy for, so basically you have to translate the data from each of those data sources into a common taxonomy that then you can begin the unification process of that data model to then get that value. So let's talk about that a little bit, as far as, okay, so let's look through these different steps. So okay, I've gone through my network. I've got all these WMS. I got all this stuff. I've got the technology people to where I can get the data out of the system. You've talked about a lot of these failed attempts by other organizations in this process. So I'd like to talk about, once you have the data in a pool, a data warehouse, where do you see the failure points? And I'll share with you our failure points too that we've seen. But where do you see the failure points that occur as they say, okay, we've got the sea of data, and now we need to start, cleaning it, massaging it, building it out so we can actually make use of it. So where are you seeing the challenges that companies are having, and maybe some of the horror stories you've heard in the market where they put a huge amount of money and it just didn't work? I'm just curious what your perspective is there.
Well, I think your example you used is a very good one. And I used to have to talk to IT people. There are some IT systems, I put up a general ledger system. I bring up the entire US on my new general ledger system, and maybe I phase it US and Europe, but I don't have to implement general ledger at every location that I might use general ledger. I standardize my general ledger. I make certain decisions about the data model for my general ledger system when I implement it. The challenge that we've had in warehousing, and I think this is common in manufacturing as well, where you have MES, is same with WMS, they are implemented site by site. Now, leading edge companies start off trying to build a standardized template. If I'm using say I'm buying a brand new WMS today, and I'm going to roll that out to those 10 WMSs, I can say, okay, when I start my design process, we are going to define a common data model for all 10 of our warehouses. And then hopefully by the time I get done, that stayed legitimate. Now, sometimes you'll see that people will have different types of warehouses. So out of those 10, maybe I have, 4 that's an ambient warehouse. If I'm in grocery, maybe I have a frozen warehouse, maybe across. So there will be nuances, but some things, product master, customer master, employee master, all that kind of stuff, I want to try to standardize. The problem is, for many companies, they, like I said, they might, have been putting in a Blue Yonder or Manhattan in one place, but they got SAP and they're using SAP WMS someplace else. That was a completely different project team, might have been done 5-6 years ago. Now, am I going to go back in and rip and replace what they did to standardize their data model at the location WMS level? No, now I got to figure out, that's my point about Klingon and English. I got to go figure out, well, this is what we did in SAP. How are we going to do that? This is what we did in Blue Yonder. How do we do that? And now whatever I want to come up with, it's almost like in the old EDI, build a giant canonical model. So I figure out how I can accommodate both of those. And, then you bring in, cultural issues, organizational issues. it just has proven to be much more complex. We've been talking about things like supply chain visibility, supply chain event management, control towers for the last 25 years at Gartner. And it was when I started, and there have been many fewer successes than failures. And I think it all comes back to, hey, I can put all nice tools to render the information in a really pretty format and show it. But if I can't get the data model right, which is proven very difficult for companies, that doesn't work. I'll give you an example. We had, a client, I can't name them, but it was a large food and beverage company, and they had a food division, they had a beverage division, and they were trying to come up with a common system. And just those were, the Hatfields and the McCoys. And I was in a presentation last week, just getting them to agree on certain things. Now, some of that, there could sometimes be legitimate issues. So then you have to figure out, well, how do I accommodate those? Other times it's just Hatfield and McCoys. They just, we see the world differently. And if you don't get that right, then everything else you're trying to do at the end isn't going to work. And we saw a lot of failures because of that.
Yeah, I'll throw another wrench into that too, though, because you're just talking operational units and how they view their product mix, how their workflows go. That's strict, just from a pure kind of operational nomenclature thing. Now let's throw in stakeholders.
Yep.
So I've got a finance group that has a very specific way they look at things. I've got engineers, industrial engineers that care about certain things. I've got my operators, and I have my overall executive leadership. So I have these different stakeholders that they just care about their one thing. They all get this out of that data. But when you build this model, if you do not bring all of those people into the room as you go through this process and basically slug it out, because that's what it is, you really you almost need an on-staff psychologist to help everyone work through this. You can't even begin to send that to the IT department until you've kind of gone through and aligned the stakeholders with the data, what they want out of it. And then, of course, now you have this highly fragmented data environment. So you've got this, you've got to, we always say, when you're going into the full unified data model, you really need to spend about 6 months of deep planning, understanding your data, understanding the KPIs, all the measurements, all the value that you want to get out of the data by stakeholder, and then bring everybody in the room together to get them understanding each other's lenses through which they see the world. And, you brought up a thing I didn't think about, which is like these industry sectors, right? If one group under a conglomerate is dealing with, packaged goods, the other's dealing with beverages, they have very different paradigms that you have to wrestle with as well. But you've got to get through that process before you can even begin to then hand this off to the IT people who are going to start doing this. And if you don't do that, the thing with the IT is they're not going to have that operational depth of running the floor and all of that. So, what they need is that, well-defined scope of work that they can build to. And if you don't do that, let's say you bring the finance people in a year later with their asks, often you have to start over from scratch, shred it, and rebuild it. And we've seen companies that took what would be an 18-month project, stretch it to 4 years because they've done these resets several times because they weren't able to bring that together.
Well, it's
so from our perspective,
So I was at a supply chain planning system vendor in the 1990s. If you looked at demand planning, inventory planning, those systems were designed, to be operating at the unit level. How many widgets am I going to sell in a day, week, month, whatever? And we built these systems, and then companies would build these hierarchies of, if I want to do a forecast adjustment, I want to be able to do it at, my red, Air Jordan sneaker and be able to propagate that down. Well, what we found at that vendor was, we would get the unit forecasting group would be in and they would do that. Well, then later on, they were saying, well, for our sales and operations planning process, we're going to bring in the finance people. And now we want to be able to monetize that and look at it. Well, the entire data model I built and my hierarchies and everything, for, the kind of the unit view of the world was completely different. If I wanted to put dollars around it, we would try stuff like just multiply by the that was too oversimplistic and it didn't work. And exactly to your point is people say, okay, now we want to turn on S&OP. Guess what? We got to go back and rip and replace, relook at our data model so that we can look at that, because it wasn't that anybody was being bad. No one thought about bringing the finance people in the beginning, because they're just saying, hey, I got a project to get my, demand planning system up and running the next month or next 9 months. It's the same kind of thing, because just the view of the world was different. And then to your point is, if you think it's going to take 3 months, plan it for 6.
Subscribe to the Performance Driven Warehouse wherever you get your podcasts. For proven data strategies and guidance on warehouse performance management, visit easymetrics.com. Until next time, let data lead your performance and never stop improving. Keep turning complexity into performance.